The boy I once bullied is now my boss, and he's not letting me forget it. Trapped in a web of guilt, humiliation, and the echoes of a past I can't undo, I find myself locked out of my own future, both at work and in my heart. But when an unexpected moment of vulnerability brings us face to face again, can we ever heal the wounds of our past, or are we doomed to repeat the mistakes that tore us apart? The story opens with Keith rushing to work on a stormy day. He's running late, and the downpour has soaked him through. His clothes cling to him as he desperately tries to get to the office on time, emphasizing his sense of urgency and the weather's harshness. As Keith dashes through the rain, he barely dodges cars and puddles, illustrating his frantic state in the chaotic environment. Despite his efforts to reach the office, he's very aware of the fact that it's especially important not to be late today because Hector, his boss, is in the office. This introduces Hector as a key figure and sets up Keith's dread, knowing that his boss has a tendency to be critical or even malicious. As Keith continues running, a taxi driver yells at him for running across the street in such a hasty manner, barely avoiding the car's bumper. Keith shouts a quick apology, but it's drowned out by the storm, reinforcing the notion that Keith feels small and powerless against the overwhelming situation. The rain, the chaos, and the looming presence of Hector set the stage for the tension and humiliation that will unfold later in the story. Eventually, Keith reaches the office building, which looms ahead like a glass monolith. The description of the building is almost mocking of his efforts, as if it's a symbol of his frustrations and struggles. His arrival at the building comes just in time. Keith checks his watch and sees that he has only 5 minutes to spare. Despite the miserable weather, there's a brief glimmer of hope that he might make it inside without further trouble. Keith, still soaked to the bone, raises his briefcase over his head in a futile attempt to shield himself from the rain and makes one final sprint toward the office entrance. When he reaches the door, he tries to swipe his keycard, only for it to malfunction. The red light flashes repeatedly, preventing him from gaining access. Keith is increasingly desperate as he swipes the card over and over, but the result is always the same, a blinking red light, an indication that he's locked out. His frustration builds as he stands there, drenched, with the rain continuing to pour down. This moment symbolizes his feeling of being trapped, both physically outside the office and metaphorically stuck in a life that's spiraling due to his past mistakes. The situation intensifies with Keith's realization that this malfunction is not just a glitch but a deeper problem, a symbolic barrier that mirrors his current life. The combination of being locked out of the office and the storm outside makes him feel completely overwhelmed, and the moment seems to reflect the culmination of everything that's gone wrong in his life recently. Keith's frustration and helplessness are palpable, setting the tone for the emotional journey ahead. Just as he's about to reach the breaking point, Hector, his boss, appears, marking the beginning of the antagonistic relationship that has defined much of Keith's life. Keith receives help from Roger, an older journalist who works at the same office. After being locked out in the rain, Keith finds himself at a bus stop, huddling under the meager shelter, still shivering from the cold and feeling humiliated by the events of the morning. As he waits for a break in the storm, he notices Roger, one of the more experienced journalists at the paper, heading toward the office entrance. Keith hesitates for a moment, but then decides to approach him, clearly needing help. Roger is depicted as someone who has always treated Keith with kindness and respect, especially in a workplace where Hector's cruelty and manipulation dominate the environment. This familiarity and decency give Keith a sense of relief, as while Roger's warm demeanor contrasts sharply with Hector's cold and mocking behavior. When Keith calls out to Roger, his voice is still shaky from the cold, and Roger immediately notices. There's a mutual understanding between them, and Roger's expression softens, signaling that he knows something is wrong, and that Keith is struggling in a way that goes beyond just the weather. Roger, without hesitation, agrees to help Keith get into the building. He recognizes that Keith's keycard is malfunctioning and doesn't question it. Instead, he calmly fishes out his own keycard and swipes it against the sensor. Immediately, the light turns green and the door clicks open, allowing Keith to finally enter the warmth of the office. This moment serves as a small but meaningful gesture of kindness, offering Keith not only physical access to the building but also emotional comfort in a situation where he feels entirely out of control. Once inside, Keith is grateful, but there's still a lingering feeling of unease and tension. The warmth of the office contrasts with the damp misery of the storm outside, but it doesn't provide Keith the comfort he needs to fully relax. He's still trapped in his mind, where he knows that Hector's presence in the office will make the rest of his day even more difficult. As they walk through the lobby, Roger pauses, looking at Keith with a concerned expression. Roger is perceptive enough to sense that something is going on between Keith and Hector, something deeper than just work-related tensions. Roger tries to offer advice, suggesting that Keith should talk things out with Hector and resolve whatever is between them. However, Keith is reluctant to open up. There's too much history, too much hurt, and too many emotions involved for him to easily share the truth with Roger, even though Roger's concern is genuine. Keith is internally torn. He feels a deep sense of guilt and regret over his past actions, and knows that revealing the truth about his relationship with Hector would be emotionally overwhelming for both of them. Instead of speaking up, Keith opts for a non-committal response, nodding to Roger in a way that suggests he wants the subject dropped. Roger, sensing the tension but respecting Keith's space, eventually lets it go, sighing wearily and allowing them to part ways without pushing further. This scene is pivotal because it highlights the key dynamic between Keith and Roger. While Keith's relationship with Hector is filled with tension, manipulation, and past trauma, Roger represents a support system and a reminder of kindness and compassion. Roger's actions contrast with Hector's cruelty and provide a brief respite for Keith in an otherwise challenging environment. However, even with Roger's help, Keith is still confronted with the larger emotional turmoil of his past actions and the unresolved conflict with Hector that continues to haunt him. Keith has an uncomfortable and humiliating encounter with Hector in the office bathroom, which further exacerbates the already tense relationship between them. After Roger helps Keith get inside the building, Keith, still drenched from the rain, hurries to the bathroom to dry off. The bathroom, which is empty when he enters, provides Keith with a brief moment of privacy and relief. As he wrings out his shirt over the sink, he's trying to regain some composure, both physically and mentally. The warmth of the office building should offer him a sense of comfort, but the weight of his frustration and the looming presence of Hector hangs over him. Keith just wants to get dry and out of this difficult day. However, just as Keith is finishing drying off, he hears the unmistakable sound of a toilet flushing. His heart sinks when he turns around and sees Hector stepping out of one of the stalls. Hector, ever composed and confident, doesn't even acknowledge Keith at first. His indifference to Keith's situation becomes a form of silent mockery. Hector casually walks to the farthest sink, as if he's not just caught Keith in a vulnerable and humiliating moment. The contrast between Hector's pristine appearance, untouched by the storm, and Keith's soaked, disheveled state underscores the imbalance of power between them. Hector exudes an air of superiority, almost savoring the discomfort he knows Keith is experiencing. As Hector goes through the ritual of washing his hands, taking his time and acting as though everything is normal, he shows no empathy for Keith's condition. Keith, despite being in a dire situation, tries to explain himself, citing the storm and the malfunctioning keycard as reasons for being late and soaked. However, Hector cuts him off with a dismissive wave, further underlining his lack of compassion. Hector's response is cold and calculated. He doesn't care about the storm or the inconvenience Keith experienced. Instead, he focuses on the fact that Keith is late, using it as an opportunity to remind him of his failure and to reinforce the power dynamic between them. Hector notes that Keith is an hour and 20 minutes late for work, and then adds that he will be docking Keith's pay for the lateness, as if it's a matter of routine. This encounter is a pivotal moment in the story because it highlights Hector's cruelty and desire to humiliate Keith further. Hector's actions are a deliberate form of punishment, almost as if he's relishing in Keith's discomfort. Despite Keith's explanation, Hector doesn't show any signs of understanding or forgiveness. Instead, he uses the opportunity to assert his control over Keith's life, emphasizing the power imbalance that has existed between them since their high school days. Keith is left standing there, physically exposed and emotionally drained, unable to defend himself or change the situation. This moment encapsulates the emotional weight Keith carries: his past mistakes with Hector, the years of humiliation, and the overwhelming guilt that still haunts him. It also signals the deepening of the rift between them, with Hector continuing to hold power over Keith's life, both in the workplace and emotionally. Keith begins to reflect on the past, specifically his involvement in bullying Hector during high school. After his humiliating bathroom encounter with Hector, Keith walks home feeling defeated. The heavy rain that continues to pour mirrors the emotional storm brewing within him. The frustrations of the day, the tension with Hector, and the bitter memories of his past all weigh heavily on Keith's mind. As he trudges through the streets, his thoughts drift back to the years when he was just a teenager, and he remembers the events that led to his broken relationship with Hector. The flashback to 12 years ago reveals the origins of Keith's deep sense of guilt. Back in high school, Hector and Keith were close, at least until Ryan Westwood, the school's notorious bully, began targeting them. Ryan had a cruel method of bullying, going down an alphabetical list of students and picking on them one by one. On that particular day, Ryan's attention landed on Hector, and it was clear that Hector was going to be the next victim of Ryan's torment. Keith, however, wasn't just an innocent bystander. He had a choice to make, and it was a terrible one. Ryan, the bully, offered Keith a deal. In exchange for sparing him from his torment, Keith would have to bully Hector, his own boyfriend and high school sweetheart. In that moment, Keith was paralyzed with fear. The situation became even more intense when Ryan pulled out something that held great sentimental value to Keith: his kitten, Mittens, who had been missing for days. Ryan dangled the defenseless animal in front of Keith as leverage, threatening to throw her out of a window if Keith didn't comply. In a moment of cowardice and desperation, Keith made the heart-wrenching decision to push Hector away, shoving him hard enough to send Hector's books sprawling across the floor. Hector, completely blindsided and hurt, looked up at Keith with confusion, betrayal, and sadness. The pain in Hector's eyes left an indelible mark on Keith, one that would haunt him for years. The flashback ends abruptly, but the impact of that moment lingers, showing the depth of Keith's remorse. Keith recalls the hurt and confusion on Hector's face, knowing that he destroyed their relationship with that one selfish act. His decision to betray Hector wasn't just a mistake. It was a pivotal moment in both of their lives, one that ruined their connection and altered the course of their futures. Keith's reflection reveals that the guilt he carries is more than just about a simple mistake. It's about the destruction of someone he cared about deeply, and the knowledge that he chose fear and self-preservation over loyalty and love. As Keith continues walking home, he feels the weight of his past actions pressing down on him. The shame he feels is compounded by the realization that he didn't just hurt Hector back then, he inadvertently shaped his own suffering in the process. Every humiliation, every prank Hector pulls on him in the present feels like a karmic consequence of what Keith did years ago. He believes that Hector is seeking revenge for the pain Keith caused, and that this is simply the universe's way of making Keith pay for his past sins. This realization makes Keith feel trapped in a cycle of guilt, unable to escape the past that continues to haunt him in his present-day struggles. Keith grapples with the idea that his ongoing struggles, both in his personal life and at work, might be some form of cosmic retribution, a way for the universe to balance the scales for the wrongs he committed in the past. As Keith walks home from the office, the weight of everything that has happened over the last few months crashes over him. The difficult day at work, the confrontations with Hector, and the humiliation he continues to endure, all seem to him like part of a larger pattern of punishment. The idea of karma, which has been a vague concept in his mind, now takes on a more personal meaning. The more Keith reflects, the more he becomes convinced that his current misfortunes are not just coincidental, but are somehow tied to the mistakes he made when he was younger. His thoughts are consumed by the idea that he is being punished for his past actions, especially for the cruelty he inflicted on Hector back in high school. The malicious pranks that Hector continues to pull on him at work, the surprise last-minute tasks that keep him stuck at the office late, and the increasing isolation Keith feels. All of these experiences start to feel like a form of payback for the way he treated Hector as a teenager. Keith is struck by how closely his situation mirrors the torment Hector must have felt all those years ago. In the same way that Hector was trapped in a cycle of bullying by Ryan, Keith feels as though he's caught in a never-ending loop of personal and professional misery. There's an overwhelming sense of inevitability in Keith's thoughts. He feels as though no matter what he does, he will never be able to escape the past and the consequences of his betrayal. His attempts to move on and build a life for himself are constantly undermined by the shadow of his previous mistakes, making him question whether he will ever be able to break free from the guilt and shame that cling to him. This internal struggle deepens when Keith considers how Hector has been dealing with him in the workplace. He realizes that Hector's actions, particularly his ongoing treatment of Keith, may be Hector's way of seeking revenge, of finally exerting control over the person who wronged him all those years ago. Keith's fear is that no matter how much he tries to atone for his past, Hector will always see him as the same cowardly teenager who betrayed him. The feelings of guilt, the sense of helplessness, and the overwhelming burden of his past mistakes all contribute to Keith's growing belief that he deserves the mistreatment he's receiving. Yet, despite his belief in the cosmic justice of karma, there is a part of Keith that hopes for change. While he feels trapped in his own self-inflicted punishment, a small voice inside him longs for reconciliation and a chance to make things right with Hector. The tension between accepting his fate and wishing for redemption creates a sense of internal conflict that continues to simmer beneath the surface. This battle between guilt and hope is a crucial aspect of Keith's emotional journey, as he struggles to find a way to move forward while reconciling with the past. Keith's ongoing experience at work is marked by a series of manipulations and power plays orchestrated by Hector, which only deepen the sense of hostility and emotional turmoil between them. The period after Keith's arrival at work feels almost like a continuation of his suffering, as Hector's actions, ranging from petty pranks to manipulative tasks, reinforce the control he holds over Keith's life. These actions further erode Keith's sense of self-worth. making him feel as though he's trapped in a cycle of torment with no escape. The tension between the two men is palpable, with Hector continuously finding ways to make Keith's professional life more difficult. A deliberate move that Keith begins to recognize as Hector's way of seeking revenge for past wrongs. The idea of punishment becomes even more prominent as Keith reflects on how these challenges at work seem to mirror the bullying Hector experienced in their younger years. At the office, Hector's behavior has taken on a more calculated, albeit subtle, form of torment. Keith constantly finds himself subjected to last-minute tasks that seem designed to keep him from enjoying his personal time, specifically his weekends. These tasks, which are always dropped at the last moment, force Keith to stay late in the office, working through what should be his time off. The fact that Hector is the one responsible for these late-night assignments only adds to Keith's sense of helplessness. It feels as though Hector is intentionally ruining his weekends, just as Keith once ruined Hector's life with his actions in high school. In this period, Keith's internal monologue reveals the full extent of his emotional turmoil. He starts to see his professional misfortunes not as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger, unavoidable narrative of karmic justice. Keith begins to feel that the universe is balancing the scales for the wrongs he committed years ago. Each surprise work assignment, each prank, and each moment of humiliation at Hector's hands feels like a repayment for his past betrayal. The irony is not lost on Keith. He now finds himself on the receiving end of the same emotional and psychological torment that Hector endured during their high school years, and he can't help but feel like he deserves it. However, this period of emotional reflection also serves as a point of reckoning for Keith. He becomes painfully aware of the depth of his own cowardice as a teenager and the lasting damage it caused to Hector. He realizes that the pain he is enduring now is nothing compared to what Hector went through. This realization weighs heavily on him as Keith finally understands the emotional cost of the betrayal he committed all those years ago. In some ways, the constant harassment at work has become a reminder of the consequences of his actions, forcing him to confront the guilt he's carried with him for so long. Despite the ongoing torment, there's a growing awareness within Keith that Hector's actions, while cruel, might be a form of revenge or emotional release for him as well. Just as Keith is suffering from the guilt of his past actions, Hector is still clearly carrying the burden of the emotional scars left by that betrayal. For Hector, making Keith's life difficult might be a way to finally get back at the person who caused him so much pain. It's a cycle of revenge that continues to spiral, with neither Keith nor Hector able to break free from their shared history. The dynamic between the two men has become toxic, a battlefield where past wounds are continually reopened and re-experienced. Yet, as Keith continues to endure these challenges, there's a part of him that begins to hope for something more than just punishment. The emotional conflict that has been brewing inside him reaches a boiling point, and he starts to wonder whether there could be a way to end the cycle of suffering. But for now, Keith remains caught in this painful tug-of-war between his past mistakes and the ongoing consequences that play out in his professional and personal life. His journey of self-reflection and emotional healing is still ongoing, and it's clear that only by confronting the deep guilt he feels for Hector and the actions of his past can he hope to move forward. The emotional tension between Keith and Hector reaches a boiling point when the two unexpectedly share a moment of intimacy. After weeks of animosity and cruel treatment from Hector, Keith finds himself in a vulnerable and impulsive state during an evening at the office. This point represents a significant shift in their dynamic, as it is the moment when Keith's pent-up emotions of guilt, frustration, longing, and confusion manifest in an unanticipated kiss. The kiss occurs during a period of relative silence while the two are working together on an article, and it serves as an outburst of emotions that Keith can no longer suppress. The moment is deeply impulsive, and Keith doesn't fully understand why he does it. He only knows that it feels right in that fleeting moment of connection. Hector's reaction to the kiss is initially one of shock and confusion. He freezes, not immediately reciprocating, but the fact that Keith has taken him by surprise reflects the complexity of their relationship. Despite everything that has transpired between them, the years of torment, betrayal, and manipulation, the kiss reveals that there is still some lingering attraction or emotional connection between them, even if it is buried under years of pain. The kiss symbolizes the unresolved feelings that have been simmering beneath the surface of their interactions for a long time. Keith is uncertain about what it means, but in that moment, he's seeking something more than just professional interaction. He's looking for a release, a form of reconciliation, or perhaps even an acknowledgement of the emotional tension that has existed between them since high school. For Hector, the kiss seems to stir something within him as well. After the initial shock, he doesn't push Keith away or react with anger. Instead, he breaks away from the kiss and, in a more subtle shift, looks at Keith with a mix of emotions, something close to hesitation, confusion, and perhaps even longing. The kiss doesn't fix the tension between them, but it does acknowledge the depth of the emotional undercurrents that have been present for years. Hector's decision to kiss Keith back, even if it's softer and more measured, suggests that there may be unresolved feelings of his own that he hasn't fully processed. This moment also highlights the complexity of their relationship. Despite all the pain and manipulation that has occurred, there is a part of Hector that still wants something from Keith, whether it's closure, understanding, or the rekindling of a bond that was once broken. However, even as Hector leans in and reciprocates the kiss, he quickly pulls away and asserts that this changes nothing. His words carry weight because they reflect his internal conflict. Hector has spent years holding on to his resentment and anger toward Keith for what happened in high school, and the kiss does not erase the pain or the emotional trauma that he has experienced. His response is a reminder that while the kiss may have been a momentary release for both of them, it does not resolve the years of hurt and betrayal. Hector may feel conflicted, but he is not ready to forgive or let go of the past. The kiss, therefore, becomes a temporary distraction from the deeper issues that still need to be addressed. For Keith, the kiss is a confusing and emotionally charged experience. While it offers a brief moment of connection, it also leaves him with more questions than answers. He's uncertain about Hector's feelings, and the complexity of their past makes it difficult for him to understand what this intimate moment truly means. Keith is left in a state of emotional turmoil, torn between his lingering guilt over how he treated Hector and his own desires for reconciliation. The kiss serves as a turning point, but it also underscores the difficulty of moving beyond their painful history. The emotional aftermath of the kiss lingers in both of them, and it marks the beginning of a new phase in their relationship, one that will require time, reflection, and a willingness to confront the painful past in order to heal. In essence, this point marks a significant and transformative moment in the narrative. The kiss represents not just a fleeting physical connection, but the emotional weight both characters carry. It's a moment of vulnerability and desire, yet it also highlights the complexity and unresolved tension that continues to define their relationship. While it may provide temporary relief or clarity for Keith, it ultimately leaves both men with more emotional baggage to sort through, making it clear that there is no quick fix to their fractured relationship. Keith's professional life reaches a critical turning point with the publication of an article he has worked on for weeks, but it quickly turns into a moment of bitter disappointment and betrayal. After the kiss with Hector, Keith feels a sense of hope, thinking that their shared, intimate moment might be the beginning of a change in their relationship. He also hopes that Hector's recent behavior, which has been slightly less antagonistic, might signal a shift in the dynamic between them. Keith becomes optimistic that his hard work, particularly on a feature article about unusual weather patterns in Montreal, might finally be recognized. It's a story that he's poured a lot of effort into, and he is excited to see it published. For Keith, this article is more than just a piece of journalism. It represents a chance for recognition, a chance to prove to himself and others that he's capable, and perhaps a small step toward redemption in his professional life. However, when Keith picks up a copy of the newspaper to see his article in print, his excitement quickly turns to shock and devastation. The headline of his article is there, just as he expected, but instead of his name at the bottom, he sees someone else's, Roger's name. His heart sinks as the realization hits him. The hard work that he's put into crafting the story, the late nights, the careful research, and the dedication, all of it has gone unrecognized. The credit for his article, the one thing he hoped would validate his efforts and provide a sense of accomplishment, has been given to Roger. This moment is a harsh slap in the face for Keith. He's not just being overlooked, his work is being stolen, and the injustice cuts deep. The sense of betrayal is overwhelming, as Keith feels that not only has his article been appropriated, but also that the recognition he rightfully deserved has been taken away. Keith's immediate reaction is disbelief. He flips through the pages, hoping against hope that he somehow missed it, or that there's been some sort of mistake. But as he goes over the article again, it's clear there is no mistake. Roger's name is there, replacing his, and Keith is left in a state of numb shock. He struggles to process the betrayal, especially because he had believed that Hector, as his superior, might finally begin to recognize his abilities as a journalist. The fact that Hector has allowed this to happen, whether directly or indirectly, feels like another blow to Keith, and his sense of self-worth is deeply shaken. The hope he had for his career, the one bright spot in his tumultuous professional life, feels dashed in an instant. Keith feels not only disappointed, but also humiliated. It's a cruel irony. He has spent months trying to earn Hector's approval and recognition, only to have his work dismissed and attributed to someone else. The betrayal doesn't end with just the article. Keith tries to reach out to Hector, seeking answers and hoping for some explanation. However, Hector doesn't pick up, leaving Keith feeling even more abandoned and helpless. This lack of response only deepens Keith's sense of frustration and resentment. When he finally contacts Roger, he gets an apology that feels hollow and unsatisfying. Roger expresses regret over the situation, but Keith can't shake the feeling that this is just another betrayal, another sign that no matter how hard he works, he will never be given the respect he deserves. Roger's apology, while sincere, does little to alleviate Keith's growing sense of injustice. Keith feels as though his dreams have been stolen from him, and the person he believed could help him, Hector, has instead been complicit in taking everything away. This moment marks a critical turning point in the story, as it solidifies the sense of betrayal that has been growing throughout Keith's journey. It reinforces the emotional and professional divide between Keith and Hector. Despite the fleeting moments of connection, Hector continues to act in ways that hurt Keith, demonstrating that any hope for reconciliation is fragile and that their relationship is not easily repaired. Keith's feelings of being overlooked, disrespected, and manipulated culminate in this act of professional betrayal, which serves as the final straw in his relationship with Hector. This experience forces Keith to confront the reality that no matter how much he tries to prove himself, he is still seen as inferior, not worthy of recognition. His sense of injustice is heightened, and it sets the stage for the eventual confrontation with Hector, where Keith will express his anger and frustration. The publication of the article becomes a pivotal moment, one that encapsulates Keith's emotional struggle and marks the beginning of the end of his patience with Hector and the toxic environment at work. The emotional tension between Keith and Hector reaches a breaking point as Keith confronts Hector about the betrayal he's experienced both professionally and personally. The deep sense of frustration that has been building in Keith over the past weeks, exacerbated by Hector's cruel treatment and the professional sabotage of his published article, finally boils over. Keith can no longer stay silent about the injustice he's facing, and he decides to take action. This moment becomes a confrontation not only about the stolen credit for his work, but also about the years of pent-up anger and hurt Keith has been carrying since high school. The scene unfolds in Hector's office, where Keith, filled with a mix of fury and disillusionment, barges in, interrupting Hector's ongoing interview with a TV crew. This act of defiance signals Keith's emotional shift. He is no longer willing to silently endure Hector's manipulations or cruelty. The cameras turn toward him as he makes his way into Hector's office, but Keith doesn't care about the public spectacle he's creating. All he cares about is expressing his pain and frustration, letting Hector know that he can no longer tolerate being the victim of his boss's games. Keith demands, "Haven't I suffered enough?" His voice shakes with emotion as he confronts Hector, accusing him of making his life a living hell, both now at work and in the past. Hector, who has always been in control of their interactions, is momentarily taken aback by the forcefulness of Keith's outburst. For a brief moment, his usual mask of indifference falters, and Keith sees a glimmer of guilt flash across Hector's face. However, this moment of vulnerability is fleeting. Hector quickly recovers, and his cold, calculated demeanor returns. His response to Keith's outburst is measured, but there's a noticeable shift in the dynamic. Hector no longer holds all the power in the conversation. Keith, in standing up for himself, has taken the first step toward reclaiming some of the agency he's lost throughout their tumultuous relationship. Keith's accusation that Hector has become an even crueler monster than Ryan ever was further intensifies the confrontation. This comparison cuts deep, as it reflects not only the betrayal Keith feels in the present, but also the history of Hector's suffering in high school. Keith is essentially accusing Hector of using the same tactics of manipulation and emotional cruelty that they both experienced under Ryan's reign of terror. For Keith, it's a full-circle moment, where he realizes that the torment Hector has put him through is not just personal, but deeply reflective of the pain Hector endured as a teenager. The comparison to Ryan underscores Keith's belief that Hector, despite the years that have passed, hasn't truly moved past the trauma of their shared past. Keith's emotional climax in the scene comes when he rips the name tag off his shirt and throws it on Hector's desk, symbolizing his formal resignation. The act of quitting is both literal and symbolic. Keith is severing his ties with not only the toxic work environment but also the painful emotional baggage tied to Hector. This is a moment of empowerment for Keith, one where he takes control of his own life and chooses to leave behind the cycles of manipulation, humiliation, and regret. His decision to quit isn't just about leaving the job, it's about breaking free from the emotional and psychological torment that Hector has subjected him to. As Keith leaves Hector's office, his anger lingers, but there's also a sense of relief. For the first time in a long while, Keith has stood up for himself, taking action to end the cycle of suffering that has defined his relationship with Hector. This confrontation is a turning point in the narrative, where Keith not only expresses the depth of his pain, but also begins to reclaim his sense of self. It represents the moment where he stops being the passive recipient of Hector's cruelty and becomes an active participant in his own healing. The confrontation, though filled with anger and bitterness, opens up the possibility for closure and healing, as Keith finally takes a stand and refuses to be manipulated any longer. It also marks the beginning of Keith's emotional journey toward freeing himself from the past, allowing him to move forward with his life. The act of quitting is a decisive moment of change, signaling the end of one chapter and the start of another. Keith experiences a significant shift in his life, both emotionally and professionally, after his confrontation with Hector. A few weeks have passed since Keith quit his job at Echo Pulse Media, and his life has taken a completely different direction. Rather than wallowing in defeat or staying trapped in the toxic environment he left behind, Keith has chosen to move forward in a new, more grounded path. He has started working in construction, a complete departure from the world of journalism, which he had once been so passionate about. This career change represents a major turning point for Keith. Construction is physically demanding, but it offers him the mental relief of not having to deal with the emotional turmoil and manipulations that characterized his previous job. The work in construction is tough, but it provides Keith with a sense of purpose and stability that he hadn't felt in a long time. In contrast to his previous job, where his worth was constantly questioned, Keith finds that the physical labor in construction offers a form of mental clarity. There are no complicated office politics, no emotional games being played by colleagues, and certainly no cruel pranks or power plays from Hector. It's a hard but honest job, and it allows Keith to focus on something tangible instead of the psychological strain of his past work. The simplicity and straightforwardness of construction work give him space to process his feelings without the constant reminders of the past. For Keith, this change isn't just about a job. It's about finding peace and putting distance between himself and the toxic relationships that once dominated his life. Despite the apparent peace Keith has found in his new job, there are still lingering emotions tied to his past. While he works on rebuilding his life away from Hector and the memories of his old job, Keith is unable to fully disconnect from the emotional baggage of his past. His mind often drifts back to Hector, to the moments of intimacy, the cruelty, the betrayal, and the unresolved issues that still cloud their relationship. The distance he's placed between himself and Hector has been a necessary step in his emotional healing, but there's a sense of unfinished business between them that still nags at Keith. Even though he has left behind the world of journalism, a part of him is still tethered to the past, unsure of whether he has truly moved on or if he's just running away from the deeper issues that need addressing. Then, unexpectedly, Keith receives a phone call from Roger, the one person from his old job who had been a source of kindness and decency. The call is a simple gesture, but it sparks something within Keith. Roger invites him to meet up for a drink, a chance to catch up and reconnect. At first, Keith isn't thrilled by the idea. He's been trying to put the past behind him and move forward with his life, and the thought of revisiting his old world, even in a small way, fills him with reluctance. However, Roger is persistent, and eventually, Keith agrees to meet him. This decision signals a subtle shift in Keith's mindset. He's not entirely ready to let go of his past. Instead, he's learning to engage with it from a healthier, more balanced place. Meeting Roger is a way for Keith to reconnect with the part of himself that still cares about the connections he made in his previous life without allowing those relationships to pull him back into the same toxic patterns. The meeting between Keith and Roger takes place at a quiet bar, a place where the dim lighting and soft music allow for a calm conversation. The atmosphere is relaxed, and for the first time in a while, Keith feels a sense of peace. He and Roger share a drink, exchanging pleasantries and small talk, but the conversation gradually shifts to deeper topics. Roger, ever the concerned friend, asks Keith how he's doing with his new job. Keith admits that the work is tough, but it's also less stressful and more fulfilling in a way. He's found a new sense of stability and purpose, something he hadn't had in his previous life. Roger expresses his relief and happiness that Keith is doing well, indicating that he genuinely cares for Keith's well-being. But the real turning point in the meeting comes when Roger, clearly uneasy, hesitates before telling Keith something important. Just as Keith begins to wonder what could be so urgent, Hector unexpectedly appears, walking into the bar with a calm and measured demeanor. Hector's arrival is a shock to Keith, who has spent the last few weeks trying to put distance between himself and his past. Seeing Hector again, especially under these circumstances, forces Keith to confront everything he's been running from. Hector's presence in the bar is a moment of reckoning. It's not just a coincidence that Hector is there. He has come to speak with Keith and, perhaps, to make amends for the actions that have caused so much pain. Hector's appearance brings all the unresolved emotions rushing back to the surface, and Keith is forced to face the very man he has tried to escape. Hector, recognizing the emotional weight of the situation, opens the conversation with an apology. He admits to Keith that he has been reflecting on their past, especially their high school years, and the way his anger and desire for revenge have shaped his actions. Hector's admission of guilt is significant because it represents the first time in the narrative that he fully acknowledges his role in the toxicity of their relationship. For the first time, Hector doesn't hide behind his smugness or manipulation. He shows vulnerability, confessing that he was consumed by anger and regret for much of their adult life. This admission is crucial for Keith, as it marks the beginning of a healing process between them. Hector's apology is not perfect, and it doesn't erase the past, but it opens the door to the possibility of reconciliation. Hector also offers Keith a chance to return to his old job, with a raise and a promise to make things right. However, Keith is resolute in his decision to reject Hector's offer. It's not about the job or the money, it's about healing from the toxic environment that defined his time at Echo Pulse Media. Keith refuses to go back to a life that was filled with manipulation and emotional torment. In the end, the encounter with Hector forces Keith to face his past head-on. While it's clear that Hector still feels something for Keith, it's also clear that their relationship cannot be rebuilt overnight. The emotional scars are deep, and both men have a long way to go in the terms of healing. However, the meeting also signals a crucial moment of closure for Keith. He's no longer defined by his past mistakes, and he's not willing to allow Hector or anyone else to manipulate him. The conversation with Hector, though uncomfortable, allows Keith to finally let go of the guilt and shame that have been holding him back. As Keith moves forward, he does so with a sense of empowerment, knowing that he can choose his path and that his past, while painful, no longer controls him. The meeting with Hector is a step toward forgiveness, not just of Hector but also of himself. Keith begins to experience significant changes in his life following his meeting with Hector and the emotional progress he's made in processing the past. A month has passed since their encounter at the bar, and Keith's life has started to settle into a new routine, one that is distinctly separate from the chaotic, toxic environment he left behind at Echo Pulse Media. While working construction, Keith finds himself more at peace, though the scars from his previous experiences are still present. This period of transition reflects Keith's journey of self-healing, as he starts to adjust to the physicality of his new job, the simplicity of his days, and the absence of Hector's manipulative presence in his life. Construction offers Keith an opportunity to focus on tangible, straightforward work without the emotional complexity of office politics, pranks, and power struggles that defined his previous job. The demanding nature of construction provides a sense of control and accomplishment that Keith hadn't found in his former career in journalism. Although the new job provides Keith with physical and mental respite, the emotional residue of his past relationship with Hector doesn't completely fade away. There are moments when Keith still finds himself reflecting on his past, on the toxic dynamics of his old job, the manipulations, the betrayals, and the unresolved feelings for Hector. These moments of reflection highlight the fact that while Keith has physically moved on, emotionally, he is still tethered to his history with Hector. The ghost of their past looms over Keith's thoughts, and despite trying to move forward, he struggles with the emotional weight of what he's left behind. The memories of their tumultuous relationship, the way Hector controlled his work life, and the deep-seated guilt Keith feels for his actions in high school still linger. Keith is learning to live with these memories, but he hasn't fully confronted or healed from them yet. However, there are signs that Keith is beginning to make peace with himself. His emotional growth becomes more apparent when he receives a call from Roger, the one person who consistently treated him with kindness during his time at Echo Pulse. Roger's call serves as a catalyst for Keith to reconnect with a part of his past without the toxicity that once defined it. When Roger invites Keith to meet for a drink, Keith feels a mixture of hesitation and reluctance. The idea of revisiting his old life, even in a small way, fills him with unease. He's trying to distance himself from the pain and anger that have surrounded his previous experiences, and he fears that reconnecting with anyone from that world will only bring the past back to haunt him. Nevertheless, Keith agrees, and this decision marks an important shift in his mindset. Rather than completely severing ties with his past, Keith is learning to engage with it in a healthier, more balanced way. The meeting with Roger becomes a step toward reconciling the past with his present self, and it signifies that Keith is ready to move forward without entirely erasing the relationships he once held. Their meeting at the bar is calm and casual, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos that has characterized Keith's recent life. The low-lit, quiet atmosphere allows them to talk without the pressures of the office or any external distractions. As they share drinks and discuss their lives, Keith begins to feel a sense of normalcy and peace that he hasn't experienced in a long time. Roger asks about Keith's new job, and Keith admits that while construction is physically demanding, it's less stressful than his previous career, offering him the chance to feel grounded and focused. Keith's sense of relief at finally being away from the emotional games and manipulations of his old job is evident. Yet, the conversation soon takes a turn when Roger hesitates and reveals that Hector is present at the bar. This revelation triggers a mix of emotions in Keith: surprise, confusion, and an immediate sense of discomfort. When Hector enters the bar and approaches their table, Keith is forced to confront the man he's spent weeks trying to avoid. Hector's presence brings all the unresolved emotions back to the surface. His appearance symbolizes that no matter how far Keith tries to run, the past is never fully behind him. However, Hector's demeanor is different this time. He seems more vulnerable and less confrontational than before. This encounter with Hector serves as a pivotal moment in the story, as it becomes an opportunity for Hector to finally address the emotional wounds that have festered for years. Hector admits his guilt over how he treated Keith and the anger that has consumed him since their high school days. He acknowledges his mistakes and apologizes for the ways he has hurt Keith, not only in the past but also in the years since they reconnected at work. Hector's apology marks a moment of self-awareness and remorse, showing that he has grown and learned from the emotional turmoil that has shaped his actions. For Keith, Hector's apology is both a relief and a challenge. On one hand, it offers the closure he has been longing for, the recognition that Hector has seen the pain he caused and is finally acknowledging it. On the other hand, it forces Keith to confront the fact that their past isn't something that can simply be erased with a few words. The apology is important, but it doesn't instantly fix the damage done. Despite Hector's apology, Keith knows that their relationship cannot be restored overnight. The scars from their past are deep, and both men still have a long way to go in terms of healing and forgiveness. Hector also offers Keith his old job back, along with a raise, attempting to make amends for the role he played in Keith's suffering. However, Keith firmly rejects the offer, understanding that returning to that toxic work environment would not be a solution. For Keith, it's not about the job or the money. It's about his personal well-being and healing from the emotional damage that his time at Echo Pulse Media caused. His refusal signifies his emotional growth and determination to move forward in a healthier direction, independent of the toxic past. The interaction between Hector, Keith, and Roger signals a deeper shift in Keith's mindset. He is no longer defined by his past mistakes or the pain of his former relationship with Hector. Instead, Keith begins to see that his journey isn't about erasing the past, but about learning from it and growing stronger. He's no longer willing to allow Hector's manipulation to control his life, nor is he willing to accept a return to the toxic dynamics of their past. Instead, Keith is learning to embrace a new, more authentic version of himself, one that is no longer trapped by the guilt of his past actions or the emotional scars left by his relationship with Hector. This encounter with Hector serves as the final step in Keith's emotional healing, as he realizes that forgiveness, while necessary, does not mean returning to a life that harmed him. The emotional growth that Keith has been undergoing in the past few weeks takes on a new depth as he begins to forge a path forward that is no longer dictated by the ghosts of his past. Although he's made significant progress in distancing himself from the toxic cycle of his relationship with Hector, Keith's story is not one of simple closure. It's a gradual, ongoing process of self-rediscovery and healing. As he moves forward in his new career and personal life, Keith comes to terms with the fact that emotional recovery is not linear. It's a series of small steps, setbacks, and moments of realization that push him toward a healthier, more fulfilled future. After the conversation with Hector, where both men acknowledge their shared history and the damage they've done to each other, Keith is left feeling emotionally raw, but also more empowered. His decision to walk away from his past, symbolized by his rejection of Hector's offer to return to his old job, shows a critical turning point. Keith realizes that he cannot return to the life he had, not because of his inability to succeed, but because that life was unhealthy and emotionally damaging. By stepping away from the toxic work environment at Echo Pulse Media, Keith is making a conscious decision to prioritize his own mental and emotional well-being over the professional and personal expectations that once defined his existence. He understands that real progress means not looking backward, but instead embracing the present and future with a clearer, more grounded perspective. Keith's acceptance of this new life, despite the lack of the professional success he once dreamed of, marks the beginning of his personal redemption. His work in construction, while physically demanding and far from glamorous, gives him the satisfaction of hard work and tangible results. This is significant because Keith begins to see that true fulfillment doesn't necessarily come from external accolades or career achievements, but from the internal peace that arises from living authentically. Keith finds comfort in the simplicity of his days, where his efforts yield clear results, and he feels a growing sense of pride in his ability to take care of himself, even in a field that's completely different from journalism. The steady, predictable rhythm of his new job provides a form of emotional stability that Keith had not experienced for years. Still, Keith is not immune to the occasional emotional wave that brings him back to his unresolved feelings toward Hector and the past. The emotional toll that Hector's betrayal and the resulting fallout had on Keith cannot be erased overnight. And there are moments when Keith catches himself wondering if he made the right decision. The quiet moments in his new life sometimes feel lonely, and his thoughts often drift back to Hector, the kiss they shared, and the pain that lingered between them for so many years. These moments of reflection highlight the complexity of Keith's emotions as he tries to reconcile the hurt and the healing. Keith has grown and learned from his past mistakes, but the emotional journey of self-forgiveness and acceptance is ongoing. He is learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting or erasing the past. It means acknowledging it, making peace with it, and choosing to move forward despite the lingering shadows. This period of growth culminates when Keith decides to allow himself to feel hope again. It's a subtle but profound shift. For the first time in a long while, Keith feels as though there is potential for a future that is not dominated by guilt, shame, or the manipulations of others. His newfound sense of hope is not rooted in the expectation of reconciling with Hector or returning to the media world he left behind, but in the realization that his life can be built on his own terms. He begins to allow himself to dream again, to think about the possibilities that lie ahead without being weighed down by the past. This is an emotional rebirth, where Keith stops being defined by the mistakes of his youth and instead starts to shape his own future, free from the control of others. Keith's decision to not only move forward, but also to embrace his life as it is, with all of its imperfections and challenges, is perhaps the most significant step he takes in his emotional journey. He is no longer holding on to the toxic remnants of his past. Whether it's his unresolved feelings for Hector, his old job, or the guilt he's carried for years. Instead, he's learning to build a life based on what he values most: self-respect, emotional honesty, and personal peace. This process of healing is slow and requires time, but with each step forward, Keith is freeing himself from the emotional shackles that once defined him. This transformation is also evident in the way Keith starts to see his relationship with Hector. The final acknowledgement of his past, combined with the realization that forgiveness is necessary for both of them to move forward, brings a sense of closure. Keith understands now that his emotional peace isn't dependent on Hector's forgiveness or approval. It's about accepting his own role in their shared history and learning to forgive himself. The steps toward healing, though difficult and often uncomfortable, bring Keith closer to the person he was always meant to be. Someone who is not defined by the mistakes of his past, but by his ability to grow, learn, and move forward. The story ends on a note of cautious optimism, where Keith's journey toward emotional healing and self-acceptance continues. He has taken ownership of his life, choosing a path that brings him a sense of fulfillment and peace. While his relationship with Hector is still complex, Keith no longer allows it to dictate his sense of self-worth or his future. Instead, he steps into a new phase of life with a stronger sense of independence and hope for what lies ahead. The past, while never fully gone, no longer controls him. Keith is learning to live fully in the present, and for the first time in years, he feels as though the future holds the promise of something better. The story transitions into a reflective moment, inviting the audience to consider the deeper themes of the narrative. Keith's journey of emotional healing, his struggle with guilt, and his eventual empowerment culminate in a moment of self-reflection that invites the audience to engage with the story on a personal level. This point serves not only as the conclusion of Keith's emotional arc, but also as a prompt for viewers or readers to reflect on their own experiences with guilt, personal growth, and forgiveness. The first key aspect of this reflection is Keith's contemplation of his past and the actions that led him to where he is now. The story, in its entirety, has revolved around Keith's internal struggle. how he's been weighed down by guilt over his past actions, particularly how he bullied Hector in high school, and how that guilt shaped his professional and personal life. This question, whether Keith has truly healed and learned to forgive himself for his past, lingers throughout the narrative, and the ending challenges the audience to consider their own personal journeys. The question of forgiveness is central here. Can one ever truly make peace with their past? Is it possible to fully reconcile with those they have hurt? And how does one heal from a betrayal, either from others or oneself? The reflective question posed at the end, did you ever have a bully? Could you make peace with them if given the opportunity? Is a direct invitation to the audience to engage with the moral and emotional dilemmas that Keith faces. It asks the viewers to consider their own experiences with bullying, whether as victims or perpetrators, and whether they believe reconciliation and healing are possible in such situations. It's a question that encourages self-examination, prompting the audience to think about the nature of their past relationships and whether forgiveness, or at least understanding, can help heal old wounds. By posing this question, the story invites viewers to consider not only the actions of others, but also the emotional baggage they may carry from their own experiences. Just as Keith's emotional healing is an ongoing journey, the story reminds us that people are multifaceted and complicated, shaped by their past experiences but also capable of growth and change. The conclusion of the story highlights that healing from past mistakes, whether in relationships or personal growth, requires both self-forgiveness and understanding of others. It's a process that doesn't happen overnight but unfolds over time. Additionally, the invitation to reflect on the possibility of making peace with a past bully is also a way of addressing the broader societal issues surrounding forgiveness and reconciliation. Keith's story is not just personal. It is a reflection of the collective struggle that many face when dealing with the consequences of their actions, or when they must find a way to forgive someone who has hurt them. The final reflection encourages viewers to think about the transformative power of forgiveness, not just for the person who was wronged, but also for the person who did the wronging. It's about finding closure and moving forward, even if that means accepting imperfections in oneself and others. The story closes by extending an offer to the audience to join Keith in a larger community of growth and self-improvement. The call to consider subscribing to become part of our rainbow force and stay wholesome not only serves as a closing remark for the narrative, but also brings the audience into a collective experience. It invites people to reflect on the themes of the story, but also to take the lessons from Keith's journey and apply them in their own lives. It underscores the importance of kindness, understanding, and personal growth, and emphasizes the power of community and support as people work toward healing from their own emotional struggles.